So do you like tipping? How much do you tip? And when do you tip? These are interesting questions because, in fact, Bankrate just did a survey, and this was the headlines. 66% of Americans have a negative view of tipping. And the timing of this article just came out. It's interesting because I was just in the USA for a couple of weeks on a trip to see my family. And I can just tell you guys, I was under a massive culture shock. You know, I live in Korea, and going back to USA, it just felt like all of the food when you go out to eat was overpriced. Plus, you have tax and tip, which even made it ludicrously overpriced. And that's just my opinion on this. But there's more than just restaurants when we talk about these topics. So I want to get your guys' opinion on this stuff. It's a really fascinating survey that they put out. So basically, they break it down into different categories on do you tip or not, and they have it done by year. So you have 2021 is the light blue, 2022 is the medium blue, and then the one in the bottom is 2023, which is the dark blue. And so basically, do you tip or not? And this is in USA. So sit-down restaurants in 2021, 75% of the people tip. That is down to now 65%, right? And you're going to find this is trending almost across all categories where people are tipping less in terms of like the amount of people who are tipping. Hairstylists and barbers, 63% of the people tipped in 2021. Now it's at 53% of the people tip now. Food delivery workers, 59 to 50, again, is down. Taxi rideshare drivers, 48% used to tip in 2021. Now it's 40%. Hotel housekeepers, 28 to 23. Coffee shop baristas is an interesting one. That's about constant. So around 23, 22% of people tip for them. Picking up takeout food, meaning like you go into the restaurant, you grab your food and you take it out. 17% of the people used to tip in 2021. Now it's down to 13. Now, when I look at these numbers as a whole, this is my general feeling is that prices have changed so much that people are like, you know what, I'm just going to pay this amount. I'm not going to tip. Meaning that, so for example, say in 2021, you're going to pay $20 for a pizza, right? And then we'll just say total tax and tip. And then say, you know, today you're like, okay, the restaurant had raised their prices by, we'll say $10 or whatever. And then you have tax and tip on top of that. And you're just like, well, in my mind, I only want to pay $20 with tax and tip. That's sort of what you had in plan. And now this seems like everything has gone up in cost. So I think this would be my explanation of why people are tipping less, because they just aren't comfortable paying more. And also, too, you can make the case that people are tipping less because they just don't have the cash anymore, right? Meaning that their wages haven't kept up with the cost of how services have picked up. Now, it's interesting, these different categories. I'd love to hear your thoughts on any one of these, right? Are you tipping at restaurants? What about your taxi drivers? What about your coffee shop barista? It's funny. I just had a conversation with a nephew of mine, and it's crazy that I say family stuff, but if you guys don't know why I talk about that is because I just met my family for the first time after 48 years, which is a whole other story. But I was saying we had this conversation in Starbucks, do we tip or not? And it's interesting because honestly, it's a gray area. Now, etiquette-wise, the simple answer is yes, tip for everything. But I think myself included with not alone here, 66% of Americans are a negative view of tipping. I think the problem is it just feels like it's too much and it's everywhere. And it just seems like, on top of the higher prices, it's kind of crazy. Now, when you ask people, though, do you tip always, most of the time, or only sometimes? This is interesting. So surveyors or wait staff, 65% said that people say always. And I thought that was kind of an interesting one because for, restaurants, that was always the basic one. You tip the waiter for me. I don't think there's any gray area for that one for me. But when you get into some of these other ones, like here's one. Furniture appliance delivery workers, only 17% of the people say they always tip. That's an interesting one. Love to hear you guys' thoughts on this one. What about like your plumber, electrician, cable installer, picking up takeout food, these kind of things, hotel housekeepers, coffee shop baristas? This changes. Now, what's interesting is when you combine it to like who is complaining and who is not complaining. First is I want to talk about how women tend to tip more than men according to their survey. So, for example, you talk about the restaurants, 70% of the women tip, 60% of the men tip. So again, women tip more than men. Hairstylists and barbers, 60% of the women tip, 46% of men. So women tip a lot more frequently to essentially their salon than the men, which is really interesting. Food delivery workers, 54% of the women tip compared to 45% of men. And then taxi and rideshare drivers, 45% women tip, 36% of men. I just find it really interesting. Women across the board tip more. It's interesting. You can make the case that maybe women care more about workers than men. You could make that case. I'd be curious what your guys' thoughts on this one, of why it would explain, why women tip more than men. You could also look at regional, which is really interesting. And these are really, really fascinating. So basically, the people in the Northeast and the Midwest tend to tip more frequently than people in the South or the West. So if you guys can explain this one, and look at this. This is a really interesting. Look at the biggest number here. Servers or waitstaff. So we're talking about sit-down restaurants. People in the Midwest, 70% of the people tend to tip, whereas in other regions, they tip a little bit less. Why the Midwest? Who knows? Maybe you guys are just more friendly, more generous. I don't know. Or maybe food costs less. And I don't know. It's really interesting. Or it could be like, how do you define what a sit-down restaurant is? Any number of these things that I think are really fascinating to check out. One thing that I think is interesting is by age. So the older you are, the more chance you are to essentially think that tipping has gone out of control. So if you're a Gen Xer, which I'm at 33% of us think tipping is out of control. Baby boomers agree with that at 33%. Young people, Gen Z, which could be in these fields, right? So maybe if you work at a restaurant, you tend to be younger, so only 22% of them think that's out of control. And millennials, 27% of them think that tipping is out of control. These are some of the questions because, some people might be asking, what does it mean? How do we define tipping out of control? So take a look at some of these questions. And these are something that would you agree or disagree with? So here's one. I typically tip at least 20% at sit-down restaurants. So do you agree or disagree with that? And this is actually an interesting one because when I was a kid, it was like 10, 50% was fine. And now we're talking at least 20%. And this was an interesting one as well. My wife's sister, she's Korean because my wife is Korean and sister is Korean. But she was in DC for about a week for work. And I guess she had this weird issue with the taxi driver because for whatever reason, she couldn't get the Uber app to work on her phone. So she had to use a taxi. And the taxi was like telling her that she had to tip 20%, and then she would only really wanted to tip 10%. And she had like this weird conversation with the taxi, and her English isn't great, so that would be an awkward situation. I'm sure you guys can imagine. And I'd be curious if you guys have ever gotten that kind of situation before, where your taxi driver or restaurant whatever is saying you must tip at least 20%. So I didn't ask my wife exactly how that would resolve. I'm not sure. I think. I'm just not sure. I just remember my wife was mentioning that to me about her sister had that issue. Here's some more. I feel like businesses should pay their employees better rather than relying on tips. So 41% of people agree with that statement. Tipping culture got out of control. 30% agree with that statement. Here's some more. I'm confused about who and how much to tip. So only 50% people say that. So evidently, most of us actually already sort of feel like we have that under control. I'm tipping less since the pandemic. Only 9% say this. And it's actually kind of interesting. I'm reading through this stuff. Here's another one. I'm annoyed about pre-entered tip screens, coffee shops and food. So that's the one where you go to the counter, you pay your money, and then they flip the screen around to you. And it's like, do you want to tip 10, 15, 20, 25, etc.? And the 32% of the people are annoyed by that. Moving on, tipping culture in the USA, like, sort of why it exists, sort of the legal ramifications of it are also really interesting. So evidently, the federal government has a minimum wage of $2.13. That's if you're in a tip job. And then the way you define that is if like in a month you get $30 or more. However, if you take a look at by state, every state has a different rules on that. So some states, because the federal minimum will just be like, that's the least you can pay someone. But then states, if they want, they can set it to be higher. Now, it seems that in the West, you can see here, this is the gray states, states that do not allow a separate tipped wage minimum, meaning that the federal minimum wage is the same as their state wage. And if you're a tip worker, you still have to get paid the same amount as everyone else. So there's a few states that are like that. You can see here, it tends to be in the West. One of the things I noticed, I was looking at the chart, it seems like a lot of the states, you can see like these dark blue ones here, states that follow the federal tip minimum wage. So these are the ones that then you can see right here. It's the states right here, these dark blue states. But they tend to be in the South, and they're the ones that say, you know what, the $2 minimum is fine or whatever. And this goes to part of American history, and this is a bit controversial. Depends who you ask. But I did a quick little bit of reading on this stuff, and the question is tipping connected to essentially slavery in the USA and that culture, meaning that like if you have slaves, you're not tipping anyone or not paying anyone basically because they're a slave. And then the idea is that you tip someone regarding, the quality of their service. And it's just kind of a classic culture on that. A couple of things that I read seem like pretty plausible. And I would tend to be on the side of like, historically speaking, yes, it seems like it does come from that part of culture, but there is an argument that not necessarily. So I just want to put that out there. I don't want to necessarily come down too hard because whenever you bring up these topics, people get really angry about this kind of stuff. But I just want to put that part is out there. One of the things too, though, that's also kind of really interesting. Last year, there was you can read the headlines here. Internet slams hotel for automatically adding optional tip to the bill, quote, optional. And I think this is where you get in gray areas of, can you just auto, add tips? And that was probably the biggest culture shock that I experienced in the USA. So one was cost of food was really expensive. It seemed like everything was like, even McDonald's was $10, and then like sit down restaurants were like, 18, something like that. And then when you add tax and tip, it was like, 20, 25 per person, if not more. I'm just talking about and this was just like basic restaurants, not even like luxury or fancy where you're paying like, close to $20 for basically a burger, not a fancy place. It was kind of ridiculous. And the thing that was really shocked to me though was the automatic adding on of tips. I just hadn't seen that before. And I was asking, and I talked to people on the plane flying the way back to Korea, and a couple of Americans were saying, yeah, this is like a normal thing now. They just add stuff on. And then I guess evidently hotels will do this as well, which I've seen on this. And I have a real problem with that. I just, me personally, if the price of something is something, just tell me what the price is so that I know. I think the issue is just that, no one really wants to be surprised by additional, say, 20, 25% at the end when you had planned that something would cost X amount. And I think that's the part that's the most irritating. I'm totally fine with tipping myself. I have no problem with tipping, although I prefer not to, meaning that I prefer to be in a country where that it's just built into the price. So going out to eat here in Korea, we don't tip at all. It's just not part of the culture. And then also too, the tax is already in the price. So meaning that, so for example, if you look at the price of something at some menus, that does not include tax. And so then you're like, don't actually know the real cost of something, but then you have tax and tip. Where I'm just telling you guys here in Korea, we just know the cost. You see the menu, that's the price, and that's what it is. And it's just a lot more easier to calculate the cost of everything. And then you don't have like this weird sort of thing of like, oh, do I feel guilty about not tipping, et cetera. And it's just, I don't know. In USA, it just feels really uncomfortable, especially when they kind of either make you do it or flip the screen and saying like, and then watch you as you, are going to choose, 10, 15, 20, 25, whatever other. So that just added a bit of stress. So I'm not thrilled about it. That's why I wanted to go through this sort of survey with you. And I'm just speaking to you guys as a human. I just think that, the sort of dining experience should be pleasurable all around. And, you should feel happy about it to be something like, oh, I'm, happy with the service and I want to give this amount of money, extra, et cetera. If you're going to live in that culture, overall, I'd prefer not to, not that I just like a mean person like that. I just want the cost of something to be it. And then I also want, to be fair, I want businesses to pay their employees a reasonable wage, right? So the whole tipping thing, again, that's why I mentioned the history of the U.S. where it may be different than other countries. I'd also like to ask you guys in the community, because we have a lot of people around the world that watch this channel, like sort of what is your culture in where you live when you go to, say, we'll just talk about restaurants, or what about your salons or barbers, or your, what was it like, the cable person comes and fixes your cable, or the plumber, these things, are you tipping for that? Also, are you tipping people when you go to the restaurant, you're picking up food to take out, so you're not even gonna eat there at all? Are you leaving a tip? And then what about the barista one? I think that one's a really, really interesting one. Love to hear your thoughts. And it's funny because I was talking to the tournament before with the nephew thing where we're like, you go to a bar, it's always been standard. You tip like the bartender per drink. But the barista one to me has always been a gray area. So love to hear you guys' thoughts on that. So thanks again for your time. Hope this is interesting and useful for you. And I will catch you in the next video.